All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. Looking forward to hearing from our speaker today, Judy Katz, who I know has been in the L&D space like forever, as far as I can remember. Like when I used to produce conferences, used to always see Judy at events. And today, Judy's going to be talking about designing for neurodiversity, the do's, the don'ts, and the definitely nots. And just really quickly, Judy makes stuff that helps people learn. She's a strategist, designer, developer, and of course, frequent speaker and writer. And so with that, Judy, I'm going to go ahead and hide myself from view and let you take it away.
Thank you, Luis. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? I appreciate the warm welcome. So like Luis says, I've been in the instructional design space for a long time now, about 25 years. It's kind of interesting because what we're going to talk about today is really just something that I have brought out in the last year or so, started speaking and writing about. It's a much more sort of personal topic. And I love to have a lot of conversation around this topic. Unfortunately, I was just telling Luis before we came on, I found out at another conference at Learning Solutions that it is possible for this topic to run over and over and over and over. So I highly encourage you to put questions and comments into the chat. I may not stop in the middle as much as I would like to and as much as I normally do, because I really want to make sure that we have time for everything, for all the content to be covered, and then we can answer questions, and I can even move out into a table in the meeting area where we can keep up the conversations if we'd like. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to say, first of all, I think I forgot to change this with TLDC, but some of the terminology around this is changing pretty rapidly, and my understanding of it is even changing. And so we changed this session to neurodivergence instead of neurodiversity because we're specifically speaking about divergent neurotypes here, such as ADHD and autism. And diversity you can think of as, in the same sense that we talk about diversity normally, that it encompasses everyone. And so we're specifically speaking about neurodivergence today. And I've got all of my credentials here on the first slide. I am happy to say that this is a topic that I can talk about from experience. I am autistic as well as ADHD, or what we call ADHD. So this is a very important session for me, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed putting things together for everyone. So first of all, I want to start off talking about the social model of disability. And I am going to use the word disability in this session, and some people are kind of turned off by that. Some organizations don't use the word disability anymore. They might use differently abled, or they might use different words. And honestly, the word disability was a little bit of a turnoff to me at first as well, when I started realizing that I was neurodivergent. Someone introduced me to the social model of disability, which, as opposed to our normal understanding of disability, where we are quote unquote disabled by the impairment that we have or by our difference from the quote unquote norm, the social model of disability says that we are disabled by barriers in society, and that essentially we are quote unquote disabled because society is not designed for us, and is only designed for the typical brains, the typical bodies, et cetera, et cetera. And so essentially what we're doing today is reducing disability, because we are going to talk about reducing some of the barriers in society, and specifically in the workplace, in the learning and development world, reducing some of those barriers to everyone having a productive learning experience that works for their brain. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about about what we're talking about in terms of neurodivergence. I'm going to preface this with I am not a psychologist, just a researcher and a person sort of on the inside of this. But I'm going to share a few things about what neurodivergence is and what it is not. First of all, it is considered neurodivergences or different divergent neurotypes are considered disabilities. They are by definition congenital or hereditary. They are not necessarily the same as mental illnesses or learning disabilities, although some neurotypes are also learning disabilities. Mental illnesses are separate. So for example, anxiety, depression, eating disorders are mental illnesses, and they are separate from neurodivergence. Neurodivergence as a concept is actually not recognized by the DSM or the ICD, whatever it is now, 10, I think. And it is more something that has come through as a concept. It's something that has been born from disability activism. And so it's a little bit of a layperson's term for these things that are also diagnoses. The ones that we're going to mainly talk about today are autism and ADHD. There are others as well. So for example, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia are neurotypes that are also learning disabilities. There are others as well. The one that is sort of an exception in the divergent neurotypes list is PTSD, or well, actually all of the trauma ones, PTSD, CPTSD, and traumatic brain injury are considered neurotypes because they do affect the brain. However, they are not hereditary. They are they are created by trauma, and they are as such also considered curable. The changes that they affect in the brain may actually be reversible. A lot of disclaimers here, in terms of how we talk about these things. If you are a psychologist or if you have access to the DSM, I'm going to talk about things differently from how they are talked about in the more medical communities. That's because of, what I've already mentioned, that a lot of these concepts are more arising from the activism communities, from the self-advocacy communities, among particularly the autistic and ADHD worlds. All right. Mainly today, we're going to talk about autism and ADHD in terms of how they affect someone's learning experiences and how we can alter people's learning experiences to accommodate them. A lot of this will also be very, very relevant to people with trauma-based neurodivergences, such as PTSD, CPTSD, and TBI. And just in general, a lot of these things are going to help for a variety of things. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Objectified. It's a lot about product design. And one of the themes that comes out in that movie is that, or it's a documentary, again, about product design. One of the themes that comes out is that when you design for the extreme ends of the spectrum, and I'm not using spectrum in the autistic sense here, but when you design for the, for example, designing a vegetable peeler, when you design for children or people with arthritis, the people at the extreme ends of the spectrum, you often create a more usable experience for everybody in the middle as well. And a lot of the things that we're going to cover today sort of fall into those categories. Not only will they create a more usable or a more pleasant or a more comfortable learning experience for a lot of people, not just neurodivergent ones, but they will also create a more a better experience for people with other kinds of disabilities. So this is something that people kept piping up the first time I gave this session and said, oh, that would really be better for this and such. Yes, absolutely. A lot of these things will create a better learning experience for neurotypical people, as well as neurodivergent people of all kinds, as well as people with other kinds of disabilities as well. I've been using these brain scans, by the way, and this is mainly just for decoration, but actually using brain scans to to examine different neurotypes is still a very young and somewhat controversial thing. But just to dig into a little bit of what we know or we think we know about autism in particular, the scan on the left is is a scan of Temple Grandin's brain, and on the right is a typical neurotypical brain. And Temple Grandin was an animal activist, an autism activist, who's still alive, still out there doing great work, writing books and such. But it kind of shows that whatever, far from being I guess, a deficit in the brain, typical autistic brains make a lot more connections a lot more quickly than neurotypical brains. Again, the science on this is still very, very new, but this is some of what we think we know. And the effect of that is that, well, there are a lot of different effects of this. Some of it may be to cause sensory issues, communication differences, differences in how people focus. Autism and ADHD, by the way, are very related. There's a ton of overlap between people who have autism or autistic people and people who have ADHD. Sorry, I started to say one thing and went the other way. There's a ton of overlap between those. So when we talk about issues of focus, those often apply to autistic people as well as ADHD people. Anyway, just a little bit of interest in the brain scan type of thing to talk about like some of the underlying brain differences that we see. I mentioned that there's a lot of overlap between the people, like the set of people who have autism, who have ADHD versus who are autistic. It's approximately 70 people, or 70% of autistic people also have ADHD. And so there's overlap not only literally in the actual communities, but also in the manifestations of these different neurotypes. There's a neurotypical, or a neurodivergence researcher who has a Tumblr and makes a lot of these Venn diagrams with the overlaps between different neurotypes. We're going to see another one, but I love these because sometimes we're just not talking about just one set of symptoms or manifestations. We're often talking about comorbidities when we talk about neurodivergence. And sometimes those comorbidities interact in weird ways. So of course, the best way to learn about this is, of course, from a meme. So I love this one because this is very, very typical of people who have both ADHD and or autistic. ADHD, can't remember where I put my phone. Somebody else, I'll ring it for you. Autism, it's on silent in case somebody calls. So sometimes these things intersect in very, very interesting ways. I hope you found that funny. I do like to treat this with humor. I can't really see the chat. So I hope you found it funny. But yeah, I do like to joke about this stuff. Even the autism stuff, the ADHD jokes are inherently more funny. I'm not entirely sure why that is. But hopefully by the end of the day, you'll find something lighthearted in all of this. All right. So the way that I split this up, because we're talking about the do's, the don'ts, and the definitely nots. The way that I split this up is that the definitely nots are going to refer to things not to say and not to use whenever you are talking about someone who's autistic or someone with ADHD or just generally somebody who's neurodivergent. Where the definitely nots are going to cover the DEI portion of this. So one of the things that I want to encourage in terms of creating a more comfortable learning environment and workplace for your neurodivergent learners is that you do some study about how we want to be represented. So this is a little bit more of a DEI topic. And then we'll talk about the accessibility, inclusion parts of it in terms of actually designing training differently for for neurodivergent learners. Okay, so starting off with the definitely nots, the DEI portion, we're going to talk about representation and what words to use, what images to use, and what not to. So language, there are a number of phrases that are not fantastic for neurodivergent learners. And by the way, the definitely not, the DEI section does focus a lot more on autism because there's a lot more stigma, and it's treated as kind of a heavier topic, I think. Born out of that stigma, there are a lot more euphemisms and, phrases that have come about that are problematic in different ways. So first, you've heard me correct myself a couple of times. This is just because, I freestyle when I talk, and especially switching back and forth between talking about ADHD and talking about autism. Generally, autistics prefer not to say that we have autism. We prefer to say that we are autistic. It's an identity. It also goes against a lot of disability, common disability language, because most disabled communities prefer to use person-first language. Autistics prefer identity-first language. We're not the only ones. Deaf community also does the same, as my understanding, and it's just a preference. But this is one of the things that I think as an autistic person, we automatically know when somebody is writing an article, when somebody is talking about autism or autistics, we automatically notice whether they're using person-first language or identity-first language. And often when somebody is using person-first language, that means that things are coming from an actually autistic perspective, meaning it's actually somebody autistic who is talking, or at least somebody who is paying a lot of attention to the wants of the autistic community. And so that is something that kind of automatically clues us in that, this is somebody who can be more trusted than somebody who is saying has autism. So all of these are problematic in different ways, and I'm probably not going to have time to go through all of them. I do have some articles to reference at the end. One is one that I recently wrote specifically on, mostly this topic, but I'll go through very, very quickly. One of like I said, the top one, and I think one of the easiest ones to address is to say that somebody is autistic instead of they have autism, or actually have some examples here. Is autistic. The autistic community prefers this language. If you know one autistic, you know one autistic. So we also say that if you know one neurodivergent, you know one neurodivergent. That goes back to all of the different manifestations that neurodivergence can have, and the fact that not everybody has all of them. Not everybody has all of them in the same amounts. And so that's a phrase that you will hear pretty commonly. Also, as opposed to normal, the word you've already heard me use a couple of times, the word that we prefer is neurotypical as opposed to neurodivergent. Other things, a little bit autistic, you're either autistic or you're not. If you say a little bit autistic, it's usually because you're not understanding what the spectrum is. People say, oh, you can be a little autistic because it's a spectrum. No, that's not what it means. There are lots and lots of good articles on the internet about that. And that's more than we have a ton of time for today. It's a fascinating topic and a pretty deep one. Asperger's is no longer an official diagnosis. It's also not, it's kind of out of fashion to use because Asperger was probably a Nazi. So all of those language choices are ones to avoid. And I'll follow up at the end and see if there are any other deep dives and questions about those. In terms of graphic design, using blue and using puzzle pieces are pretty outdated and not preferred. The reason is that both of those are closely associated with Autism Speaks, which is probably, if you've heard of any charity-based autistic organization. You've probably heard of Autism Speaks. Autistics consider them a hate group. We don't support them. They don't support us. So using blue and using puzzle pieces and things that are so closely aligned with them is definitely not an inclusive thing to do for autistics and other neurodivergents. The neurodivergence in general is represented by a rainbow infinity symbol, or specifically a gold infinity symbol for autism. And other types of graphic design related things that you might do to be inclusive for neurodivergent learners. So it's kind of hard to represent neurodivergence visually because it's a hidden disability. There's no such thing as looking autistic or looking ADHD or looking TBI or anything like that. However, some of the things that neurodivergent people tend to do can be normalized in visuals, such as people managing their sensory inputs through headphones, through dark glasses, or stimming, which is also called fidgeting, or using fidget toys. Usually neurodivergent people will refer to it as stimming. And that's basically a thing that helps us keep focus and helps with, I guess, dopamine in some ways. And so normalizing the use of those, not just among kids, not just among boys, but having those kinds of images can be a very inclusive thing to do. The last part of this is where, as an autistic person, I get to lecture everyone else on social skills, which is very satisfying in some ways, because there are a lot of things that, despite the fact that autistic people tend to get the reputation of not having very good social skills, there are also a lot of things that people, neurotypicals and others, tend to say and do about autistic people that are pretty bad as well. So first of all, speculating that someone is neurodivergent, I cannot tell you how many times I have heard in the workplace and among friends, even when people know that they are talking to someone who's neurodivergent, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, oh, they might be a little bit autistic, as a way of explaining why somebody is a jerk or a bad boss or is uncaring. And that's just a really, so it's just a terrible, uncaring, unfeeling thing to do. I think that if you were to replace that with, any gender or race or nationality instead of neurotype, I think that it would be clear why stereotyping somebody according to that is a really terrible thing to do. And that's kind of both the first and the second here, saying, oh, they might be a little bit autistic, that's why they act like that. So first of all, if you don't know that someone is autistic, that's not only rude, it's a violation of their privacy. It also stereotypes autistic and other neurodivergent people. So really kind of a terrible thing to do, but it's something that I see dropped casually all the time still. Using functioning labels like high functioning or low functioning. This is part of the diagnosis structure these days, but it's something that a lot of autistics reject. And instead we might say something like, I am autistic and I have no daily support needs, instead of high functioning, or I am autistic and non-speaking, to indicate, the specific types of support that are needed rather than saying low functioning and high functioning. And of course, the inverse of that first bullet is you don't look autistic or you don't seem autistic. This is again, autism and other excuse me. Autism and other divergent neurotypes are invisible disabilities. There's no such thing as being too pretty to be autistic or too female to be autistic. These are highly just based on stereotypes, and we want to try to eliminate those. So I'm actually going to take just a moment. Like I said, I can't, when I'm in this view, I can't really see the chat, but I'm going to switch out and see. Oh, fantastic. A yoga ball as a stem. Normalize offering a variety of fidgets. Yes, we're going to see that when we get into the, oh, I cannot wait to come back and read all of the comments. I just wanted to see if there were any sort of urgent questions before we go into the last part. Okay, so somebody said I always use identity first unless I know. Yes, this is a really good point. You always, everything that I'm saying here is subject to somebody's individual preference. There are lots of people who still self-identify as Aspies, for example, because that was their diagnosis. It's no longer a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean everybody has to haul themselves back in and get re-diagnosed. So we're a very literal people sometimes. And so if you were diagnosed with Asperger's, then chances are you might still identify as an Aspie, or you might have a different preference in terms of identity first versus person first. So always, care more about the individual preferences of whoever you're talking to than the whole. But particularly where it comes to identity first versus person first language, know that if you are speaking or writing, or you for whatever reason cannot ask somebody's individual preferences, know that this is that identity first language is the preference of the autistic community by about 80 to 20. So about 80%. So that's a pretty overwhelming number. You're in very safe territory, assuming identity first language. But if you are in the position to ask somebody, then that is also a fantastic thing to do. Or, of course, if you just know their preferences, use their preferences. Okay, so let's talk about designing and delivering learning experiences. I know that this is going super fast. It's a ton of information. We actually still have 3 different sections to get through under this, and these are the do's and the don'ts of designing instructor-led training, which is where we're going to start, virtual instructor-led and webinars, and then we'll go on to e-learning. And most of the things in instructor-led, some of those things will also be applicable to virtual instructor-led and e-learning. So I won't repeat myself a ton, but I don't think that there's anything that really conflicts. If you learn something in instructor-led and you think, oh, well, that could be applicable to e-learning as well, I don't think that there's anything that that says, oh, this is a good idea for instructor-led but isn't for e-learning. So without further ado, then let's go on to instructor-led training. Now, instructor-led training can be extremely difficult for autistics in particular. Also a lot of this with ADHD, but in particular, autistics tend to have sensory sensitivities that come into play with instructor-led training. So I tried to find the stock image that I could find that looked the most like hell for me, for an autistic person going into an instructor-led training. Notice that everybody is looking directly into a bright, it's not even a wall, it's a wall of windows. This would be way too bright for me in person. It feels like everybody is sitting really close. So not only can that just feel too close in terms of personal space, but it also might mean that there's more smell that can be distracting. So intrusive smells can be a problem. Other things that can happen in the physical environment that are problematic might be flickering lights, like the fluorescent lights in offices. This is one of the reasons I will never work in an office again. Machine noise. A lot of us can hear machines that either neurotypical people can't, or they just block out the noise, and we're not as able to. Loud or complex sounds can be very problematic for people with auditory sensitivities and auditory processing disorder, which I also have. And so complexity of sound can be extremely overstimulating and stressful. And by the end of the day, trying to filter down to just the sound that you are trying to focus on can literally just leave you exhausted. So the complexity of a lot of that, which can be muted out in virtual instructor-led training, but can't be in instructor-led training. All of that can be very difficult. Another thing that can be a problem with instructor-led training and being in a physical space is unclear or missing signage. One of the things that can be very difficult for autistics in particular is a lack of spatial awareness, a lack of like geographic awareness. This is, again, a personal axe for me to grind because I can get lost in a parking garage. So if I'm in a new space and there isn't really great signage, for the bathroom, for other rooms, I'm not given very explicit instructions about where to go, that can be a really, really challenging, stressful thing. So some do's and don'ts for the physical space in instructor-led. If it's possible, try to make it so that the classroom is not entirely bright. Maybe there are some dimmer areas. In some of your pre-training communication, ask for people to refrain from scents. And this is one of the things that sometimes people speak up and say, oh, this is also really good for people with allergies. This is also really good for people who get migraines. People who wear heavy perfumes or colognes really should be refraining from those in training spaces, professional spaces, for all of those reasons. I think that these things are getting more and more common. Personally, I can smell people's laundry detergent. And I can't ask everybody to switch to an unscented laundry detergent the week before they're going to be in any training classroom, but at least refraining from heavy perfumes and colognes is super helpful. The turning off, if there is maybe a fridge or something in the room that doesn't have anything in it and can be turned off, that can help with the electronic or electric noise. Try to keep other audio things simple, so keep people from talking over each other. Very clear physical signage. Somebody mentioned normalizing STEM toys and keeping those in the classroom. I would say quiet STEM toys so that people don't get distracted by them. It is possible for somebody to need STEM toys themselves and also get distracted auditorily by other people's STEM toys. So I would say quiet STEM toys for everyone. And then also allow for comfortable clothes. Where it's possible, see if you can kind of bring down the requirements for fancy dress, because comfort is a very important thing. Physical comfort is a very important thing, again, in terms of eliminating distractions. I feel like since the pandemic and since a lot of us have seen each other, in t-shirts or pajamas, over Zoom day to day, I think that this is kind of easing up. And I know that as a trainer, as an instructional designer, you don't necessarily have all of the leeway to do all of these things, but where you can, affect change where you can. Also, a lot of these things are trainers' decisions, but as an instructional designer, we are often telling the trainers what to do and how to set the stage. And so this could become not necessarily what you do because you're not necessarily the trainer, but it might be part of how you prepare your trainers to do the training. Part of those pre-training notes that you give trainers. So here we go. As a trainer, don't single out people who are managing sensory inputs. My children get to do this in class. They put on their headphones because they are managing their sensory inputs. It's kind of weird that we don't necessarily trust adults to do the same. A lot of things I think that happen, particularly in instructor-led training, are more about instructors being, a little all about themselves, I think, or they don't want to seem like they're allowing people to not listen to them. And so I would encourage us to let some of that go, and to consider that some of the things that people might do are very important to their learning space. Also, don't require people to move to the front. Again, similar kind of thing. Let people be where they're comfortable. I'm not going to have the opportunity to, and I don't want to read through everything on slide, but I'm going to give a little bit of time and also call out some of these. I was trained when I started training, I was trained to ask the question and then say somebody's name. Like, what do you think about that, Luis? Because it would train people to always pay attention. And honestly, it's just kind of cruel. So because I have that habit now, because I was trained to do it from, early on in training, I sometimes then have to follow up me saying somebody's name with re-asking the question. And what I try to do whenever I'm training is use everybody's name first, so they know they're being called on and they can actually listen to the question that I'm asking. So, Luis, what do you think about that? That would be an example of doing that appropriately. Allow time to respond, be comfortable with silence. And not everybody likes group activities. If there are alternatives, again, something that you might affect as an instructional designer is alternatives for group activities. And don't pull a lot of surprises. Let people know what to expect. Don't require touching, don't require eye contact, and don't police people's tone. So if they are being very direct, then take that for what it is, and don't try not to be offended by the tone, because this is something that happens quite commonly, and particularly autistic people get called rude whenever we're just being direct. So try to ease up on that, but also absolutes don't require touching. Don't touch somebody without their permission or as a surprise, and don't require eye contact. We can talk. There's some writing coming out, some articles that I'm going to go further into the eye contact issue. So let's try to finish up. Virtual instructor-led and webinars. A lot of the issues in instructor-led training go away. Because a lot of those sensory things aren't an issue whenever somebody is actually in their own physical space that they're able to control. So virtual instructor-led has a lot of advantages over instructor-led training. There are still a few do's and don'ts that we're going to go through. So utilize the chat. Have a producer if at all possible. Do things that, like having slides, that can minimize the need for auditory only inputs. When possible, have closed captioning and or transcription. This is not just for people who can't hear. Auditory processing means that at some point my ears are full and I can't process. I can still hear. So the sound is still overstimulating me, but I have no more ability to process what I'm hearing than a person who can't hear what is being said. So closed captioning is super, super important. And there are other things that are very common virtual instructor-led types of things, like striving for good audio quality. And I like to provide links, which I'm going to do today, to some of the resources for further reading. And so that people can explore some of the content aside from just the in-person experience. Now, this is a little bit controversial, but one of the things that really does help neurodivergent learners is to not require that cameras always be on. That can make us feel watched. It can be distracting. Sometimes just having a break from being on camera is a really good thing. And I understand why trainers don't like that. I understand why you like to see faces. But having the requirement that the camera, excuse me, always be on is, excuse me, seem to have a cough this morning. Okay. But requiring the cameras always be on can be a very distracting thing. And then of course have some ways of conveying information other than just talking. And finally, let's talk about e-learning. Now, the issues that kind of remain for virtual instructor-led are largely solved by e-learning. So personally, I think that e-learning is one of the most neurodivergent friendly methods. However, there still are some ways to make it a very frustrating and confusing experience. For example, if the layout is confusing or conflicting, or there isn't room for good exploration. So let's look at some of the do's and don'ts there. As much as possible, I would allow for free navigation and exploration. People may make different connections and have curiosity at different times than what you expect. And this is the case for all learners, but I think particularly neurodivergent ones. Make it easy to see where the content is or where the learner currently is in the hierarchy. This is also incredibly important for learners with TBI or PTSD. Those things affect memory. And so being able to place yourself where you are and know where that is super, super important. So both of those, the second and third bullets are related to that. Again, don't rely much on narration. I just do as little narration as absolutely possible. Usually it is not, for a literate audience, usually narration just doesn't add much, and it can make the course incredibly inaccessible. Timing as well is usually not necessary unless it actually is, in which case you can scaffold up to having timed assessments and a timed experience. Otherwise, eliminate timing. We notice small details. We notice when colors change, typefaces change, layouts change from slide to slide, and we wonder why. So if there isn't a reason, then you have these learners with this whole other layer of, cognitive load going on, wondering why everything is changing. Even if you have a lot less text on one slide than the slide before it, keep it at the same size, so that we don't think that things just got important, a lot more important, or fall into a different category. Keep things consistent, have an obvious visual hierarchy. If you're making a change to appearance, do it because there's a reason, not just for variety or decoration. Now, this is my favorite part, and I think that we can get through it in, let's say, 3 minutes. Luis really wants me to wrap it up, but in about a minute or so, but I think that we can do this. So I'm going to take, I think that content is one of the most important things to pay attention to when designing good e-learning. And I'm going to use Amelia Bedelia as an example of how to give clear, unambiguous instructions, or maybe how not to. I'm not sure how many people have read Amelia Bedelia books. She's a very autistic coded children's book character because she always does literally what she's asked to do. And I love this particular interaction because we're not only seeing that literal tendency in her, we are seeing her play against neurotypical coded characters and how they interpret things differently. So let's see this interaction. And they pitched the tent. You can see that she just threw the tent. Hooray, said Amelia Bedelia. We did it. Neurotypical coded character. Maybe we should pitch it again, said Mike. Now, you probably can tell that a couple of things are going on with Mike. Number one, he understood what was actually meant by pitching the tent. So he knows that they did it wrong. But instead of saying you did it wrong, he says we should do it again, which she also takes literally. So let's go on. Why? Said Amelia Bedelia. It's in the bushes, said Harry. That's a good place for it, said Amelia Bedelia. It's out of the way. So you can see some of the hilarity that ensues whenever instructions are not clear and ambiguous. Another thing that can be very, very problematic is when things are not QA'd well. This is an actual screenshot from a friend of mine who is ADHD and autistic and was taking this course to become a CNA. And you can see that he answered correctly. He answered oral communication, but he still got it wrong. I could tell, as an instructional designer who specialized in e-learning for 25 years, I can tell that somebody just didn't QA this course well enough. But he is sitting there on question 2 of 25, wondering, well, did I get it right or did I get it wrong? Am I going to flunk this? Blah, blah, blah. Am I going to get another chance? Can I report this? So of course, what he really did is send me a picture and said, please tell me that you're not responsible for this particular e-learning. I was like, no, I'm not responsible, but I can totally see why this is driving you insane. All right. So of course, for everyone, this is a good thing to do, but I think that for neurodivergent brain types, this drives us particularly up the wall. Keep the content relevant. This is something that we try to do for all learners, of course, but I think that for neurodivergent learners in particular, we tend to have sort of a lower tolerance for divergences and provide closed captioning for reasons that we have already talked about. I have a slide in here, by the way, that is another one of those beautiful Venn diagrams, and I just meant to move this to the beginning, but forgot about it. I will put some links in the chat for this Tumblr, but I think that it's really interesting to look at the kinds of overlaps that are there with ADHD, PTSD, TBI, and autism, and see how whenever we are designing for one, we're often making things better for all of the others as well. And I'm going to see now whether we need to actually leave or, whether I should go to one of the, Thank you. I just switched back and saw the hearts and clouds. Thank you so much. I am thrilled that everybody made time out of their day to be here. This is the closest thing to a labor of love that I think that I have done. And I am just thrilled by all of the chat, which now I'm going to go and read. And when Luis tells me we need to get out, I will go to one of the tables outside to answer any questions. Thank you again.
You don't need to get out just quite yet. Is it okay if I know there's some questions that, that was a lot. That was a great session.
It is a lot.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm like, yeah, that's a lot. But there are some questions that I think were answered during the session, but I wouldn't mind being able just to kind of go over them real quick if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there, okay, great, good. You have already picked things out. How do you deal with identifying? The ADHD community has not really expressed a preference here. And so as somebody who writes about autism and ADHD together a lot, it is, I feel the clunkiness. And I personally just say I am ADHD and use ADHD as a descriptor the same way that I use autism. That's me personally, but I mean, you heard me trip up over it a couple of times where I was starting to say I have ADHD and ended up saying I have autism, which we don't like to say. So I feel you on that. I end up just using ADHD in a person first way as well. But when I'm writing, that I try to be a little bit more, I say people who are autistic people and those who have ADHD typically.
Great. Okay, got another one from Karen here. Yeah, how would you deal with representing parts of the ND community that are less visible? For example, non-speaking autistics.
So this is less of a problem in the workspace, in the workplace typically, which in itself is kind of problematic. But things like using AAC devices or whatever assistive technology people might use might be a way to push that envelope. Great question. And by the way, great language, non-speaking autistics instead of nonverbal. I don't know whether you picked that up from the session earlier, but non-speaking is preferred over nonverbal because many autistics who do not speak still are verbal, still do communicate verbally with the use of AAC and other devices. Thank you very much, Karen.
Great. Okay, and then we got one last one here from Claudine.
Why not has autism? Probably people have different reasons for this, but it has to do with in general, the issue of, this is our identity. There are a lot of, this is literally our brain. A lot of people say, oh, don't be defined by your disability, blah, blah, blah. It is literally my brain type. I am not sure how I'm not supposed to be defined by what my type of brain is. This is, it generally is a kind of something that we just do feel is an intrinsic part of us. It is not a disease. It's not curable. It's just an intrinsic part of who we are. Although I also like to joke that it cuts down on the number of words, and we're in favor of direct language. So it's just easier to say we are autistic. See, the autism jokes can be funny too. All right. Not the best example anyway.
All right, well, that's it. I'm going to wrap it up. What a wonderful little chat community we had going. Judy, you are going to have to check that out because it was absolutely incredible in there.
I am. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and you did promise some links and stuff, which which I know that people really would really be interested in being able to utilize. And I'll try to get them on a resource page and stuff later too.
So I want to share that first article from Kayleen Holt, which is, I think, the first article that I read about designing for neurodiversity that I considered really good. There is more and more writing about this these days. A lot of it is not from a neurodivergent perspective. Some of it is absolutely trash. Sorry. So I love that post from Kayleen. I recently started writing a series for Learning Solutions as well. The first one is out. Basically, that covers the first third of what we talked about today, and it digs into some of the language things more and more. And there are 2 more coming out that will dig into the training design stuff too.
Great. And, and I do want to mention, this session is being recorded. You'll be able to access it right after we wrap up here if you want to go back, because I know that just so much really, really wonderful information, Judy. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just close it out. Thanks, everybody. Were you going to go jump to the tables?
I'm going to jump to the tables, yeah, okay. In case somebody wants to chat.
Yeah. We have Bela's going to be in the next one at the top of the hour, but there's a little bit of time there. So again, everybody, thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.